Okay, it's 11 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for replay. As always, joining me today is Gareth Watson, Director of Investment Management and Research at Richardson GMP. Before I hand it over to Gareth, I wanted to go over some of the current market performances year to date. So the S&P TSX has had a great start. It's up 13.2% year to date as of September 30th. That's coming off a negative decline in 2015. The U.S. market measured by the S&P 500 is up 6%. But with the strength of the Canadian dollar relative to the U.S. as compared to last year, it's only up 0.6%, so under 1% in Canadian dollar terms. The MSCI Europe Australasia Far East Index is down 0.9%, and again in Canadian dollars because of our strength over the rest of the other currencies year to date is down 5.9%. And emerging markets has had a good comeback. It's up 13.8%, and in Canadian dollar terms, it's up 7.9%. The bond index, which is measured by the FTSE TMX Bond Universe, is actually up 5.3% year to date. And I'm going to go down to the final two bullets. The 10-year government bond in Canada is actually at 1%. It's down from 1.32 in May. And the 10-year Treasury is at 1.6, and that's down from 1.85 in May. So that's where we're getting the positive performance in the FTSE bond universe. And WTI, which is oil, is hovering at about $48 a barrel. I believe it crossed over $50, and it's up 30.2% year to date. And our good old Canadian dollar is at 131 relative to the U.S. So, you know, that's been the market performance or global market performance year to date. And, you know, the one thing about today's webinar, it's a bit different from our past presentations where we focused on the market outlook. Today, Gareth and I will be discussing the most talked about and followed presidential race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and what each possible outcome could mean to the economy and the markets. As we all know, there's been two debates so far, and the first one held in September at Hofstra University, and the most recent one in Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. The debates can be considered PG rated and has somewhat been nasty, to say the least. CNN has branded the debates as the nastiest and most bitterly personal in recent history. It's definitely been a windfall for the media industry as millions of people tune in daily to see what skeletons and comments get dug up and gets reported. I understand prior to the debates, some polls actually had Donald Trump slightly ahead of Hillary Clinton. So, Gareth, on that note, where do we stand today in the polls?
Good morning, everyone. And first of all, thanks to Frank for inviting me here today to talk to you about specifically the U.S. election and how it could potentially or not potentially impact markets and the economy going forward. If we actually look at the way the polls are going right now and what they're currently saying, and of course, recent events over the past couple of years would suggest that we shouldn't always put 100% faith in polls because they're not always correct. However, if we were to believe the polls, they would suggest that less than a month from now, Hillary Clinton will be elected the next president of the United States. You would think that it would be pretty simple in terms of determining it by saying whoever gets the most votes, but of course that's not the way the system works in the United States. It is done through the Electoral College, where each state is allocated a certain number of votes based on population, and essentially, of course, your goal here is to win as many states and therefore as many Electoral College votes as possible. According to current polls, at least, it would suggest that even without talking about the swing states, and these are states that can swing from party to party between election, they're not as solidly behind one party or another. If we don't even consider those, that Hillary already has enough votes at about 273. You need 270 to win the presidency. So she's currently, supposedly at least, in good position. But of course, we still do have just over a month. In fact, yesterday marked the 4-week countdown to Election Day in the United States, which is always the first Tuesday in November this year. I should say the second Tuesday in November, which this year falls on November the 8th. Now, in terms of those swing states, if there's certain states out there that tend to always be Republican and tend to always be Democrat. Not always the case historically. It doesn't go back through time through every single election. But for example, the central parts of the United States, like Idaho, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, these are all states that are usually and have been, at least for the past 20 to 30 years, solidly Republican. Other states such as California, New York State, certainly tend to be leaning more towards the Democratic side. And it's interesting, actually, because if you look at the map of the United States, most Democratic states tend to be on the coast, tend to be on the edge of the United States, while the interior tends to be solidly Republican, and that certainly encompasses the southern states too, such as Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, and so forth. But there are several swing states that are going to determine this election. The 273 total that I have here for Hillary Clinton assumes that she has taken some previously labeled swing states, such as Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, New Hampshire, and even up into Maine. The ones that I think will get the most attention and currently are probably getting the most money in terms of advertising dollars, and we feel very sorry for anyone who lives in this state, because every other commercial is likely a Clinton or Trump commercial, or, of course, the fact that they elect everything in the state, so it has to do with Congress. Perhaps their senator is up for re-election. They do elect municipal people. They elect their judges. They elect their sheriffs. It's really quite overwhelming, quite frankly. But the states that will be in focus here are Florida, Ohio, North Carolina, and Nevada. Even if Donald Trump were to take all of those based on current polls, Hillary Clinton would still squeak out the victory. And certainly Florida is the big prize in this election with 29 electoral votes. It is the one that I think will be fiercely contested the most in these last 4 weeks, just because it has the heaviest weighting. If Hillary wins that, then it's a slam dunk. She wins the election. If Donald Trump wins it, then things will get a little tighter. Now, historically, it's been difficult to win the presidency without winning Ohio. We've seen, can't remember how many presidents we've gone through here where the winner has won Ohio as well. So this could actually be an election where we could have a president elected without actually winning Ohio, but Ohio is also very important because 18 electoral votes is somewhat significant compared to other states. North Carolina was very tight in the last election, last two elections actually. Obama won it 2 elections ago, barely lost it to Mitt Romney last election, and right now it is very slightly trending towards Hillary Clinton. And then Nevada, which is interesting because it was pretty easily in Obama's camp the past 2 times round, but certainly states that have a high Hispanic population are coming into focus here, namely because, of course, the comments that Donald Trump has made in this election campaign and how that will affect voter turnout. So these are just some of the states that I think you're going to hear more and more about in the last 4 weeks of the campaign that will determine who the president is. And more importantly, as I said, if we do believe the polls, which right now at this stage I probably wouldn't believe polls until maybe a couple of days before the final vote, they would suggest that Hillary is certainly trending towards the presidency at this stage. Now, what's very interesting about this campaign, and it's sort of, I'd say it's sort of similar to the last 2 campaigns, is that both of these candidates tend to have their solid bases of support, and there isn't a lot of movement that happens. You can't convince a hardcore Trump supporter to vote for Hillary and vice versa. The independents, of course, are up for grabs. These are people that sway from Republican to Democrat or Democrat to Republican from election to election. But for the most part, I think a lot of the pundits right now are claiming that for the most part, most of the electorate probably knows how they're already voting. And in fact, I was reading an article yesterday noting that early voting has already started and that the trend for registration is currently favoring Hillary Clinton. And this was even before Donald Trump's Friday comments were made public, and of course the second debate happened on the weekend. So things are supposedly looking good for Hillary, but I would also suggest that the fact that Donald Trump is even in the running as the Republican nominee means that the Democrats cannot take anything for granted, because he has certainly surprised many in terms of how far he has gotten in this whole process. So who would win today? At this stage, we say Hillary Clinton, but we always have to look at both alternatives when examining what will lie ahead for the economy and for the markets. Now, I will note that we talk a lot about the presidency, and, well, how can we not with the news headlines that it's made over the past few months. However, there are several other elections going on, and these are just as important because there are three branches of power in the U.S. government. You have the House of Representatives, you have the Senate, and you have the presidency. And the House of Representatives every 2 years is up for grabs. All congressmen and women have to be reelected every 2 years. It's an absolutely painful process because the United States is constantly in a perpetual election, whereas the senators in the United States are voted in every 6 years, and they rotate them so that a third of them go up for reelection every 2 years. So you never have the entire Senate up for grabs. It's usually about a third of it that's up for grabs with every biennial election. So the House of Representatives historically, at least recently I should say, has tended to lean Republican. And the way the polls are right now, they would suggest that while Republicans will probably lose seats to the Democrats in the election coming up in November, that they won't lose control of the House of Representatives. Now, admittedly, sometimes when you have, let's just say, a candidate that you can't support either on the Republican or Democratic side, you tend to either stay away from the polls, therefore don't vote for anyone, or certainly you get swayed into voting for the other party, and this impacts how, let's say, a traditional Democratic and Republican voter would actually end up voting at the polls. So things could happen between now and Election Day that could swing more support behind the Democrats, but the way that a lot of these electoral boundaries are set in terms of the different constituencies in the United States, it is most likely that the Republicans will still hold on to control of the House of Representatives. The key for the Congress, at least, is the Senate, because in the last election 2 years ago, and these were congressional elections, not presidential elections, the Republicans actually took control of the Senate for the first time in quite a while. They do have a majority currently in the Senate. However, with the third of the Senate seats up for grabs, the current projections show that about 45 senators will be Democratic, 44 will be Republican, and there's 11 races in particular on the Senate side that could go either Democratic or Republican. Currently, the pollsters are suggesting that some of these seats will definitely lean more Democratic and push the Democrats above the 50 senator level, which is what you need to have a majority in the Senate. So in other words, what I'm saying is that the Democrats could, in fact, take the Senate back in this election, and especially if Hillary is very successful at getting out the vote, getting out people to vote for her, because usually if you vote for a president, a Democratic president, you tend to vote a little more Democratic, what they call down the ticket. So all the other things that you have to vote for, and I went over them before with respect to Congress and your municipal politicians and your sheriffs and your judges and so forth, you tend to vote the same way down the ticket. So the more Democrats you can get out and vote, or the more Republicans that you can get out to vote, the more it benefits the entire ticket for each party with all the slate of candidates that they've got in each of the different races. So the big question here is the Trump factor. Trump has a huge base of support amongst, let's just call the Trump voters. There are people that certainly fall into the category of voting for Donald Trump who aren't necessarily the traditional Republicans. And what pundits are trying to figure out is whether or not traditional Republicans will actually come out, first of all, to vote for Trump, and then if they do, whether they will continue to vote Republican down the ticket, or whether or not Trump will actually keep them away from the polls and therefore take support away from all the other Republican candidates that are on a voting ballot. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out on Election Day. And also, you know, just like here, I mean, here in Canada, we have a parliamentary system. If you have a majority government, such as, for example, Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party, for the most part, you can basically do whatever you want. Yes, the Senate and the Governor General are there to stop you if they want to, but they tend not to because they're not elected. In the United States, it's a completely different story. It's gridlock. They get very little done when there is a difference between the three branches of government in terms of party. It's very unlikely that you will see one party have control of the House, of the Senate, and of the presidency after this election. If it does happen, it will probably be the Republican Party, mainly because that Congress, or the House of Representatives, is going to probably stay Republican no matter what. The other two, of course, are up for grabs. It's unlikely that the Democrats take the House. So my guess here is that no matter who becomes president, they are going to have a party, the opposite party, control at least one of the other two branches of government, and that will make the whole legislative process much more difficult, as President Obama basically has found out over the past 8 years. So just that was some background on the whole process, about the Electoral College, about who sits where, and of course about the other elections that are going on that are meaningful, that we have to pay attention to. So the question is, how does this all reflect back in terms of the market and the economy? Well, here's a table that's provided to us by our partners over at the Macro Research Board, essentially looking at stock returns in 1880, perhaps. We weren't, going back quite far actually, in terms of stock market returns and how these different categories are impacted. For the most part, our general conclusion here is that the presidential elections and the congressional elections usually don't affect stock markets that much. The one exception here, as you can see, there's that mean return of minus 0.4%. That's under a split Congress, for example, which is what we have. I shouldn't say we don't have it now, but what we used to have with the House used to be Republican and the Senate used to be Democrat. Here we have a unified Congress because they're both under the Republicans, but we could again have a split Congress if in fact the Democrats take the Senate in a couple of weeks. So that number does certainly stand out as a negative, but believe it or not, in fact, if Hillary Clinton were to win, on the whole, markets actually tend to do well under a Democratic president. In fact, there's better returns under a Democratic president than there is under a Republican president. Some people view the Republican Party as more pro-business, and you would think that that would reflect in higher returns in the stock market. That's not necessarily the case. So, I mean, you can twist this information as much as you want, but on the whole, our general conclusion is, come election day, or I should say the day after the election, we don't expect any long-term impact to stock market returns based on election results. You might get some short-term, if I can call it perhaps relief rallies, or interaction, let's say, within the next week or two after the election. But for long-term returns, we don't think presidential elections make that much of a difference.
But it's interesting, though, Gareth, when I'm going to go back to that slide that, presidential election years, the mean return is 6.8. The S&P 500 right now is at about a 6.1. So, that
right.
being said, it's kind of following the trend at this point.
Yeah, and sometimes it's kind of weird. Usually the year before an election is actually the best year. Well, I'm not exactly sure why, and I think some people have tried to determine why that is. And I don't think anyone has ever come up with a conclusive reason as to why it is that the year before the election tends to be the best in terms of stock market return, but alas, that's just what the data suggests. With respect to the markets, I've just concluded that for the most part the election doesn't make much of a difference. However, where elections do come into play is more the impact on the economy. Now, some people say, well, shouldn't the economy then impact the markets? It's not always the case. Sometimes you can have a not so good economy, but the markets hold on pretty well. Or sometimes the economy can be doing really well, and the stock market doesn't necessarily follow suit. So there's a bit of a disconnect between actual stock markets and actual economic activity. This is where I think you'll see a greater impact from the presidential election, because each candidate, of course, has his or her own policies. And the two that I tend to focus on when it comes to the election are basically budgetary matters such as taxation and expenditures, and then also international trade. Because we're in a globalized economy, and of course, international trade is majorly in focus, because the more trade you can do, the more economic activity you can generate. Now, if we look at the two candidates, it's fair to say that if Hillary were elected, for the most part on the economic front, we would probably see the status quo. We wouldn't see too much different than what we're currently seeing now with President Obama. In fact, some people have actually labeled Hillary's policies as boring, because they're not much different than what we've already got. with respect to Donald Trump, one of the key problems that a lot of pundits have had is we actually still don't know a lot about the details of his policies and what he actually stands for. And I think that he has provided a lot of examples to show that he does create policy on the spot, especially in some of the debates where he has even disagreed with his own vice presidential candidate. So it's very hard to kind of nail down exactly what would happen under Donald Trump, because some people question if even Donald Trump knows what's going to happen under Donald Trump. However, that does create some uncertainty, which does keep some investors a little nervous. But let's just take a look. If Donald wins, what can we say about what he would do? Well, on the budgetary front, he has made it clear that at least fiscal spending would likely increase. He's talked about, of course, how the United States is a disaster, how infrastructure is a disaster, how everything, quite frankly, is a disaster in the United States. So he has committed at least to increase, let's say, infrastructure spending or fiscal spending, or at least putting more money into the economy. Where that money goes specifically, no clue, and I'm sure we would only find out after the fact. And that's actually quite fair for any political candidate. Even the Liberals, when they won the majority here in Canada, they said they were going to spend all this money. I wouldn't say there was a great deal of detail in terms of exactly when and where that money would be spent, and of course that comes out in budgets after the fact. But he is committed at least to increase fiscal spending. He is also committing to cutting taxes. So this is a little bit more like Reaganomics. A return to the fact that hopefully if we cut taxes, then you will take the money that you save and then you will spend it, and that will grow the economy. Also on the corporate front, in a globalized economy, you want to remain competitive. How can you do that? How can you attract businesses from all over the world to come to your country and hire your people? Well, if you keep your corporate tax rates low, that can help. And we've seen that here in Canada since the beginning of Paul Martin as our finance minister. Between him and Jim Flaherty, they cut our federal corporate tax rate from 30% all the way down to 15%. And I think that has certainly helped our country in terms of attracting investment. Now, the key thing here is tax cuts are fine, and I don't think taxpayers would argue too much with seeing their taxes cut. But in this case, people will start questioning Donald about the fact that he wants to increase spending but cut taxes. How do you actually balance the budget, or how do you actually stop it from increasing exponentially with those two policies in mind? Now, he will argue, of course, that again, if you cut taxes, that people will reinvest all that money into the economy, and that should help your revenue line. However, I don't think it's as simple as that. So there certainly are a few question marks about how he pulls off both of these policies without letting the deficit get bigger and bigger. Now, where we certainly do know Donald's views is on trade. He has basically proclaimed that every trade deal that's been negotiated by the United States with anyone is a disaster and that he can do better. So certainly when we look at things such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, he's even brought up NAFTA because he doesn't like business going, not necessarily coming to Canada, but going south down to Mexico, that in some way, shape, or form, these trade deals could be impacted. I actually don't know what legally he can do. It's interesting, we just assume that you can back out of an agreement, but it might not be that simple. There might be some legalese there that needs to be examined. But point being is that he's taking a very a firm stance on the fact that he thinks American business is losing, and he wants to change that. Which means, could we see a renewed round of what we call protectionism, which is where you protect business in the United States to the detriment of other countries around the world? This is where trade wars start. And for the most part, these are usually not good things in the long run. You might help the U.S. economy in the short term, but for the global economy in the long run, protectionism and trade wars usually do not help. So this does raise some concerns and some angst amongst economists and also market strategists. If he were to become the president, what his impact on global trade would be by taking positions which are obviously negative against trade deals that are currently in place. So I've just also added here that his positions continue to evolve. Again, they tend to change a little bit too much, quite frankly, that we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. But I think it's quite evident that he's made it clear that fiscal spending has to increase, the taxes have to go down, and that trade has to change. So he's very different compared to Hillary. She has also committed to increase spending, perhaps not as much, obviously, as Donald. and she intends to pay for it by increasing taxes. So here's at least a policy where you could understand how the deficit does not get out of control because spending is increasing, but so is revenue. The critics of this policy will say, well, the more you tax, whether it's corporate or personal, the less it gets spent, so you're actually hurting the economy, and you could actually scare away business and scare away people from coming to the U.S. if, in fact, taxes start going up. So this actually is not as clean an equation as you might think. And these critics have fair points, both of Donald Trump and Hillary on this front. It depends on what policy you think works. If you put more money in the hands of your consumers, will they spend it? And more importantly, keeping those expenditures under control. Sometimes there is a hesitancy about spending because, of course, you eventually have to borrow money to do it and you have to pay it back. But there is a benefit from putting money into the economy that consumers are not putting in there, and that's certainly the role that government plays in many countries around the world. So her tax policy is predominantly to go off of, if I can call them wealthy Americans, or as Bernie Sanders would call them, the 1%. She's looking to close loopholes. She's looking to eliminate corporate tax credits. It's essentially a continuation of what you have seen here with President Obama over the past 8 years. Now, the one thing that, we have a number of question marks hanging over Donald Trump, but the one area where we can certainly hang a question mark over Hillary is her stance on trade. She has had different points of view in the past about various trade deals, and those points of view have changed. And some people will say it's politically driven because she wants to become president. The key one that certainly has changed is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is a trade deal that involves the United States and several countries within the Pacific Rim, including Canada. At one point she was for it, and now she does not seem to be in support of it. And many question what her view will be if she actually becomes president, if it will change back to being in favor of it with perhaps some changes to what currently has been agreed to. So the question marks are not as big around her stance on trade compared to what would happen under Donald Trump, but there certainly is a reason to question what she actually truly believes when it comes to international trade deals and whether the United States will stick by what they've already agreed to. So that's why I've noted here that even though we're uncertain about Hillary's policy, it will likely be less confrontational on the global trade front than what we would see with Donald Trump. So these are areas of the economy that I think people need to focus on when it comes to how a new president will affect, will have an impact, I should say, not just on the economy, but also potentially in the long run on markets. But I would certainly say your focus here has to be more on the economy than the markets, because the markets are impacted by so many other factors than just politics that I wouldn't put too much weight behind portfolio positioning just based on who happens to be in the Oval Office. So with that, I will turn things back over to Frank.
Thanks, Gareth. That was great. Your insights and comments are well taken, and we have been getting a lot of questions and inquiry just based on what the potential outcomes. So hopefully this will calm people down just based on the possible outcomes. As we mentioned, the current polls, which has Hillary ahead by about 14 points. And another interesting tidbit before I close it off is that we know Donald, based on his media exposure and his reality show involvement, the estimated amount of free media coverage that Donald Trump has earned during the presidency election has been about $1.8 billion, just based on him running for presidency. So if you want to take that away as an interesting little tidbit. But again, thank you again, Gareth, and your comments are well taken, and we look forward to finding out what the results are on November 8th. And for all the clients on the call, thank you for entrusting us, and we look forward to seeing you in the fall.